I want you to think for a moment, close your eyes if you'd like, of a moment when you felt the warm embrace of belonging inside a community. I want you to think of a second moment when you were responsible for policing the boundary of a community. I want you to hold those two sentiments. We're going to keep coming back to them, and to notice maybe even how it felt physically to consider both of those questions, what it feels like to identify with that sense of warmth and care and safety that community provides for you, and what it feels like, even physically, to be responsible for the question of boundary making with all sorts of consequences for those who wind up on the outside of those decision-making processes. At the heart of the idea of Jewish community, I think, is care. At the heart of the Jewish community is care. Jewish communities, physical ones that we go into, Jewish communities to which we belong that may not actually be physical, they are meant to be the places where we are cared for and where we can care for others. Maybe we're provided with the opportunity, we are invested with the obligation or the responsibility to care for others, and in which those two phenomena, the care that we are provided with and the care that we give to others, is not some purely transactional economic divide. I give to others in order that I be provided for. That is, of course, happening all the time, but in which there is a free flow of the care we offer and the care we are offered in an environment that makes community feel like that is the central value for which it exists. I'm sure all of you remember the episode from 3 years ago. It's hard to remember anything prior to 2 years ago. But an episode from 3 years ago in the summer of 2022, when many of us were gripped by watching the story taking place in Colleyville, Texas, in Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker's synagogue, when there was a hostage situation. Again, prior to the time we were using the word hostage daily, when 4 people in services were held hostage by an individual who had come in to demand the release of a prisoner from Fort Worth prison nearby. And if you remember the story, the reason this person wound up in the synagogue was because Rabbi Citron Walker invited him in, saw him as a person who might need care, saw him as a person who might need a warm space, a place for food, whatever it is he needed. He invited him in, and inviting him in created danger for himself and for his congregants. And when interviewed afterwards, Rabbi Citron Walker said, "I would do it again." Is that a right decision or not? It's not for us to adjudicate. We're certainly not conducting a halachic discussion. I think most of us would probably find ourselves maybe drawn to the majesty of the centering of care as a communal priority, and also unbelievably wary, not even consciously, of what it might actually take to have that kind of welcoming sensibility, especially now, 3 years later. Most of our communities, our institutions, our congregations, our offices here have now multiple layers of obstacles that we intentionally place there in order to ensure that we can care for those who are on the inside, and that only those who pass through those thresholds can participate in that community of care. For most of us, following the past 2 years of the rise of anti-Semitic threats, there's not even an option of being able to kind of breach the threshold of our own communities to look for those who need care on the outside and to invite them in. I want to go back to the last 4 decades prior to what's happened in the last 2 years to notice that beyond the tension that I'm talking about so far between welcoming and warmth on one hand and the fears of danger and safety on the other, prior to this becoming the core tension that is pulling apart the very notion of what it means to create communities, to invite people in and to belong to them, prior to this era, the American Jewish community was gripped by a very different tension on the question of community, and it's something that comes from the political scientist Daniel Elazar, who described Jewish community as anchored by the two ideas of kinship and consent. Kinship is that sense of belonging to the same family, the same collective, what we sometimes call Jewish peoplehood. Consent is something we recognize as inherent to most of the communities that we belong to, which is you only belong if you want to, and you only belong if other people consent to having you part of their communities. And he says basically Jewish communities are held together by both of these ideas. And prior to this era of danger and safety, the central challenge that most of our community felt around constructing and sustaining Jewish community was that kinship had given way to consent as being the dominant mechanism by which our Jewish communities were governed. Right? We were well past the era when people belonged just because they had to. That was actually pretty prominent in 1950s and 1960s Judaism. The structure of belonging for American religion was fundamentally different. You had to belong to some religious institution so that you would not be thought of as an atheist, which was even worse than being thought of as Jewish. American Jews belonged to synagogues partly out of a sense of kinship to the Jewish people, not out of a draw to religion, and partly because of sheer force of necessity. And what we have experienced over the last 4 or 5 decades is that that notion of kinship, inherent belonging, gave way to something else, which is the notion that our communities are basically environments of voluntary consent. I remember a rabbi saying to me a number of years ago, a kind of haunting story that I'm sure others of you in this room have experienced, where he said once a year, like clockwork, he gets back the membership letter that was sent out to the whole congregation to renew, and not even like in a separate card, but written on the membership letter is some version of the following sentence: we no longer require the services of the congregation. If you want to see, yeah, you know this story? If you want to see the ultimate affirmation of the notion that our communities are environments primarily governed by the idea of consent rather than kinship, it is when somebody who you see as part of your community, that you feel a sense of belonging to them, signals to you that the nature of their relationship was, from their standpoint, entirely one of transactional need. I no longer need these services. We know exactly when this happens. Maybe the last kid had their bar mitzvah or was confirmed. Maybe even the last kid was married. I no longer need this. Right? And then you have signaled this wasn't as much a kinship relationship as a consent relationship. And because this has been the trend for so long in Jewish life, our dominant concern as Jewish leaders has been fear of attrition, right? Those people who are leaving, how do we hold on to them? And a passion for inclusion. An eagerness to try to be at the threshold of our communities to ensure that anyone who's out there who we can pull in, we will succeed at actually keeping them in these environments of consent. An orientation towards what I described at the beginning, welcoming and warmth. Now, by the way, consent communities can be wonderful. When I go to Yankee Stadium, as I did on Sunday night, that is a community of consent. Everybody bought a ticket to be there, right? It was a Yankees-Red Sox game, right? So it was like really useful to have a shared common enemy in communities of consent. There are rituals, beautiful rituals that everybody participates in, right? Which include not only the songs that you sing at the beginning of the game and at the 7th inning, but also the activities that you do throughout the game. I felt a sense of warmth, the person sitting in the row before me as he hurled expletives at the Red Sox. I didn't join in because my kids were there, but I was quietly joining in together. They're wonderful. If you go to playoff games, when you walk out at the end, people are singing and cheering and hugging each other. And then, however, everybody goes their own way. And sometimes, I think many of us find that our communities of consent are also wonderful places, but too much like the Yankee game. That people are coming, but ultimately leaving, not remaining in some bond of kinship, and not even ultimately there to do that transactional work of caring and being cared for. This has been the gripping issue that has shaped so much of Jewish life for the last 4 decades, that our momentum in Jewish communal leadership has been, how do we make sure that our environments, our Jewish communities, are oriented more towards kinship and ultimately towards welcoming and warmth. Needless to say, oh, by the way, if you have just a kinship community, high warmth, low welcoming. Right? Communities that are entirely about kinship, high warmth, low welcoming. However, for the last 2 years, the central driver of Jewish communal concern around community has no longer become about consent. It has become about safety and about danger. And our real concerns have shifted from, how do we make sure that we can invite people in, keep open doors at all sides of our community, cultivate environments of warmth, and instead the fear of who may be at the door, and equally, and perhaps more painfully, who endangers us on the inside that invites us to start taking the work of pushing them out. Jewish community has therefore flipped the switch quite quickly in the last couple of years around questions of inclusion and exclusion in ways that, I don't know if you feel this, but I feel whiplashy. I played a role in this, personally. I wrote an article back in November of 2023 talking about how we were seeing ways in the post-solidarity moment of October 7th of much clearer lines that were emerging institutionally in the Jewish community between those institutions who could exhibit basic solidarity with the Jewish people in this moment of crisis, and those who were setting new ground in terms of their positioning of themselves against that story of solidarity. I described, lamentingly, that this means that the boundaries of the tent have actually become clearer than they had been for a long time. Somebody basically says, I no longer want to be in your tent. That's sometimes a little bit of a gift, signaling, great, now the difference between us is clear, but it is also deeply tragic. Because as opposed to an orientation of everybody who I lose in a moment like this is a loss, which governed Jewish communal life for decades, instead it becomes, well, now I feel safer if I can more clearly articulate who belongs with me and who doesn't. Meanwhile, though, once again, kinship makes this complicated. The minute you decide it's really easy to lose people, to set up boundaries, to let people go, to push people out, you are signaling either that kinship doesn't really matter to you, or that it is fungible. Fungible. And the definition of kinship is it's not fungible. And the place where this is felt most acutely in our Jewish communities is when we are talking about danger and safety when it comes to who can belong in our community, but the people we are talking about are our children, or their friends' children, or other actual relatives, where kinship goes from being a metaphor that is used to describe the Jewish people to a literal expression of those who are our kin. And then the decision to say, for my own safety, I am going to narrow the tent that I have and exclude those who are kin, paradoxically means that we are embracing that story of consent as defining Jewish life more than kinship that we have been fighting against for 4 decades. You've seen a total reversal of those very categories that have shaped our concerns about Jewish community just in the past 22 months. And in all of this, and I think we all feel it, that central mission of Jewish community to be places of care slips to the background. In a climate primarily oriented around danger and safety, care starts sounding like a luxury. Today we're going to talk about all of this, the idea of community, what we've learned from the past couple of years, and what I think we need to get back to. Your sources are on the tables. Here's what I'd like you to do in Chavruta. I want you to do sections 1, 2, and 3. But you see, importantly, not 4, right? So 1, 2, and 3. In the first section, you're going to see some texts on how consent operates in creating community. A well-known text, our best Jewish text about how a community needs to be defined by consent, which is the Babylonian Talmud Shabbat, on God overturning the mountain on the Israelites. There's a lot of deep stuff there about how consent works. You'll get the text that I shared with you, a brief excerpt from Daniel Elazar on kinship and consent, as well as from a legal theorist, Heidi Hurd. And then I want you to look at 2 rabbinic texts that play out the implications of consent for Jewish community belonging by talking about how we can do what we are allowed to do on behalf of others who are members of our community and what personal autonomy they retain even as they belong to our communities. I want you to think through this tension of kinship and consent as we think about Jewish community. The second section is thinking about this idea of communities as site for care. I gave you 3 texts that I think are the anchors for what we mean when we talk about big tent, that ubiquitous idea that is used to describe Jewish communities. I gave you 3 texts that are kind of the anchors of the core ideas that are exemplified in what it means to try to create Jewish communities that are big tents. And the third section, which is just really 1 text, starts to get at what happens when we construct those who are in our midst as enemies, what obligations we have towards them, and what rights we have to protect ourselves from them in those moments. You're playing with kinship, and I want you to continue to play with these categories, the kinship, consent categories, the safety, warmth categories, and this core thesis of community of care. And I invite you in your Chavruta to not just study these texts, but to reflect on the ways that these tensions are showing up in your community and what it looks like to be a leader who can hearken back both to those sensibilities I asked you to consider at the beginning of what it feels like when you are held in a community of warmth and care, and what it feels like when you are responsible for policing the boundaries. It's 9:35. We're going to come back together. What time we go till 12:15? We'll come back here at 10:45. Okay? Enjoy your learning. Okay, I wanted us to consider through this learning and using the frames I talked about at the beginning around kinship, consent, danger, and safety, to consider essentially both the conceptual question of what it means to organize community in relationship to the power of personal autonomy. That's one of the kind of driving questions we have here. And at the same time, knowing that personal autonomy is not the only organizing principle that defines community. And second, to consider in the second section of the sources what we mean and what we hope for when we try to imagine communities that are premised on care as one of the organizing principles of what communities should be. In other words, not just the political infrastructure that helps us think about community, but also some of the goals that we have in mind, spiritual and inclusivity, that characterize what our communities are supposed to be about. What I find striking about the Gemara in Shabbat in 88a, which I said is kind of the classic text that we use in thinking about consent as an essential organizing principle of community that stretches beyond the boundaries of simply kinship, is that it reminds us that while the modern Jewish experience, even in the way I talked about it before, the last 4 decades, what have worried Jewish communal leaders is that personal autonomy and the ability to move in and out of community sounds like a modern conceit. Shabbat 88a reminds us that this has actually been an ancient story recognized by the sages even in periods of time in Jewish history when you could only belong to Jewish life, in which entry and exit was much more difficult. This is expressed by the line in the Gemara where Rav Acha Yaakov says in response to the depiction of the Torah being given at Sinai as an act of coercion that comes to the Jewish people, the response is, Moda Rabba Leoraita. This is a pretty strong argument against the inherent legitimacy of Torah itself. What would it mean to insist that belonging or being obligated or being responsible is something that happens that is outside of your control? What it reflects, it seems to be, is a desire by the rabbis to restore agency, personal responsibility, right? The right of consent back into the story of what it means for Jews to ultimately be Jews. And the best expression of that is the answer that Rava then gives by saying, no. The fact that the Torah was once given to the Israelites in a coercive manner, right? We understand that's kind of a problem when it comes to the nature of personal consent. But the Israelites ultimately are by then the Jewish people, because the term Yehudi then makes sense in the book of Esther. That takes place generations later when we voluntarily consent to take our side of the covenant. And the key piece textually that underlies the brilliance of Rava's answer is, of course, that the book of Esther reflects the only book of the Bible in which God's presence is not mentioned. In fact, in many ways, the whole thing is a midrash on divine absence. Haster, astir, I will hide my face, in the book of Esther. In that context, depicting then the voluntary claiming of obligation outside of the framework of divine coercion gives back to the Jewish people in this story a sense of total agency. It gives them back a story of voluntary consent. Now, this text primarily is used for consent as we talk about obligations and responsibility. But I want us to think about it also as a framework for thinking about community and belonging, where here too, kinship, in Daniel Elazar's distinction, creates obligations upon us that we almost can't ever let go of. Right? You belong to communities of kinship in many ways against your will. You're born into them or you are adopted into them. You have relationships that you can't shed even if you may try. You can work hard to shed them, but there's something residual that almost feels coercive. And here, as in the case of here in the Gemara in Shabbat, reminds us that that is insufficient to make a full claim on belonging. I have to find a way to retrieve the dignity and autonomy that comes with consent in order to make this whole. Community has to consist of both of these drivers, the things that make us belong independent of our own choices, and the right, and I really think the word is dignity, the dignity of communities that predicate them on consent. I wanted to start here because even though our communities have been afflicted for decades by the fear that we have become transactional and voluntary, right? There is also dignity in what it means for the Jewish people to be able to say, I do want to belong to this community, I don't want to belong to that. It is a boogeyman because we feel we are the custodians, the gatekeepers of communities that people don't often want to be a part of. We feel judged by that. But the flip side of that is that our people are also articulating an ancient expression of the need for them to be able to articulate their own responsibilities, their own commitments, and the question of when it is they want to belong. We operate with this notion of consent all the time in communities. As Heidi Hurd, a legal scholar, tells us, there's a moral magic of consent. I think it's just an incredible phrase, that by sheer force of will, we have the ability to foist obligations on others or to take on belonging ourselves. By deciding to be part of a community, I've now created this whole world of obligations and responsibilities. Now, we oftentimes don't fully actualize it. As I said before, many people belong to communities transactionally, and that feels tragic. But you also know that for many, many people, ourselves included, the minute we choose to belong, we feel committed in deep ways. It goes against our will, right? We feel we are obligated to others and they create obligations to us. And then when people let those obligations down, when they let us down, or when we let other people down, we feel we have betrayed something more than just that original choice to belong. We feel we have broken something. That's what I think she's trying to capture with this terminology of the moral magic, that's supposed to be the thing that makes communities work, even if it's not kinship. Like, we know how kinship creates obligations, but even consent, even something that's rooted in the individual choice, which sometimes goes in our direction and sometimes goes against it, has this, in essence, coercive power. And here's why I wanted to bring you the Mishnah and the Gemara about this premise of Zachin Adam Shalo Befanav, right? What you can do for others not even being in their presence, right? Or when they're not in your presence. Because this is right at the razor's edge of what entitlements do I get by being part of a community, even if I am part of that community voluntarily? What can communities do for me? And what agency are they never allowed to take away from me? And it's very simple for the rabbis. You can do things on behalf of your members that benefit them. You cannot do things for your members, not in their presence and without their consent, that harm them, that limit their agency. Right? So here too, the rabbis are playing with some notion of kinship. Yeah, we feel we're connected to each other, but they are trying to hold on to the rights and the autonomy of individuals to say, even though I belong to this shul, even though I belong to this JCC, there are things that can be done that are in my benefit, but they can't really be done for me or against my will, to try to make sure that any conversation about community still validates the consent of the individual. So what's going on in Mishnah Eruvin? The basic first thing to understand, by the time we get to the second half of the text, is that there are two types of Eruvs. There's an Eruv of courtyards, where multiple people ultimately agree to turn their property into a shared property, which allows them to, for instance, carry on Shabbat. You've basically turned the public domain into a private domain, right? That's one type of Eruv. And the second Eruv is an Eruv of distances, right? That you're not allowed to go past the Tchum Shabbat, the distance that is prescribed for Shabbat, which also constitutes a kind of metaphysical halachic magic. That's the distance by which you can't go, which can be extended through Eruvin. Right? So one of these, the rabbis say, you can do on behalf of another person because it ultimately benefits them. Include that person in the Eruv, even though they didn't tell you they wanted to do that, because it's only to their benefit. But actually, demarcating the boundaries by which a person can travel could be a liability to them. So that we don't allow to do in a person's presence. The other thing to understand about the first half of the Mishnah, which I understand is a little bit confusing about the money to the shopkeeper, is that there is a particular nature of how a person has to participate, what action a person has to do to be part of an Eruv, and it requires some activity of lifting, claiming. Problem of handing money to a shopkeeper to buy into the Eruv, for the perspective of the rabbi who says that doesn't count, is because they haven't done that particular activity. But once you give money to the third party, who then gives it to the baker, who then hands over a loaf of bread, that's a legally binding action. Now this may or may not be interesting to you, right? And hopefully it's useful from the perspective of studying Mishnah Eruvin, that there's a certain set of actions that have to take place, and you can't like smooth over those actions in order to acquire the Eruv. The more significant piece, however, is this second half. The willingness to say, there are things you can do on behalf of others that are coercive, meaning, I've now made you part of our community, even though you didn't ask to be. I'm allowed to do that if it's for their benefit, but I'm not allowed to do that if it comes at a certain cost. I want to start thinking about what that means for how we construct communities that are premised on consent, where we are desperate for people to belong more. We are allowed to do things for people who are hovering around our community that bind them tighter to us if it benefits them. We are not allowed to do things to members of our community that bind them tighter to us if it actually feels like it compromises them. I think there's something very rich here that I want to continue to unpack. The second text, however, that takes this even one step further, feels so sharp to me because it extends not just to, well, by making this Eruv, you are now allowed to, walk with your baby carriage or bring over a loaf of bread to your neighbor on Shabbat. The rabbis want to now extend this notion of zachin la'adam shelo befanav even to the very story of belonging to the Jewish people itself. What is being deliberated in the Gemara, and this is just magnificent. To me, it's less of a halachic text, even though it's encoded as a halachic text, and much more of a spiritual text about what it means to belong to the Jewish people. And the underlying question is making somebody Jewish to their benefit or not? Is it a benefit or a liability to be a member of the Jewish people? Now, the conclusion that you saw in the Gemara is amazing. A baby, benefit. Why? They don't know the alternatives. So therefore, we think this is basically a good thing, but we ultimately want that when a person is at the age of consent, that for them to belong to the Jewish people, it should actually be a choice that they are making which validates their personal autonomy. I don't really care about the personal autonomy of a baby. So I might as well lean on the side of, it's good to be a Jew, we need more of you anyway. We're willing to do that act of conversion of a baby. But I don't want my love for the Jewish people, as profound as it is, and my need for numbers, to force other people to be part of our community until and unless they can express their willingness to belong, having seen alternatives, and having decided nevertheless to be part of the Jewish people. What happens when we apply this to thinking about the nature of how we want others to belong to our communities? Leave aside the conversion question, right? This Gemara would seem to imply that in order to actually enlist people in belonging, they have to have the agency of choosing not to. This has to operate our notions of community as intrinsic as they feel to so many of us. this whole notion of community is premised on the right of people not to be there. And what happens to our own attitudes of sadness and disappointment when people choose not to belong, when we recognize that their choice is also a kind of holy embrace of dignity and autonomy that is not merely the product of the age of individualism and social media and all these things, but something that Chazal are trying to bequeath to us as essential to what it means to be Jewish. In the same way that the Torah makes no claim on us unless we ourselves voluntarily choose to claim it, so too, community doesn't mean that much if it is a coercive mechanism that does not involve the right of people to opt in and opt out. This is now an incredibly high threshold for our communities to maintain in order to continue to enlist people, and it puts the burden from those who would treat us badly transactionally a lot more on us. The second idea I want us to consider is what we mean when we talk about a big tent. I said at the beginning that fundamentally, I think that the beautiful idea that lies at the heart of community, Jewish community, is the notion of care. That these are places where we care for others and we are cared for in turn. The oldest specific reference that I think I can find, although it may be in Isaiah, but the version that's most commonly known of who has a big tent is Abraham. If you followed the story that I tried to organize chronologically of these Midrashim, it kind of seems like the first person who's really described as having who's literally described as having a tent open on all four sides is not Abraham but Job. The Midrash Rabbah has the suggestion that the main tent of Abraham was open on all sides, and I love that there's both an explanation that describes the infrastructure, the architecture of the tent, and then Rabbi Yudan comes along and says it was like a large plaza. This is a Greek word, making reference to the Roman civilization in which the rabbis are living. No, don't. We know these. This is exactly what it was supposed to look like. And that way enabled Abraham to see where wayfarers were going so he could run out and care for them. But Job's tent is a little bit different, right? Job's tent also has doors on all four houses, on all four sides, but not exclusively or primarily so that he can run out in pursuit of guests, but to make it easier and more possible for people to come in. And who are the people who are coming in? Well, the text says it's the poor. But what is the central plot point of Job? His house, for the majority of the book, is a shiva house. That's what this is. Job's house is a shiva house for the entirety of his life. And why are the poor coming in? What can you find at shiva houses? Abundant trays of deli and rugelach. Right? That's what's available. You know this, by the way. You know this habit of the people who seem like they're basically just there to snack. Right? It's a little tacky. But it might also be the point. It suggests that one thing that this text at least suggests, that one thing the Shiva house is about is that, of course, the primary obligation seems to be that mourners come in to comfort the mourner, visitors come in, rather, to comfort the mourner. In other words, people come in to care for those who are on the inside, but that the deli trays are actually the ways in which the mourners care for others. I saw this actually not in a Shiva house, but this is common practice in Haredi communities. I saw it at my first cousin's kid's wedding in Mea Shearim. My first cousin is a Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva in Mea Shearim, and this was one of his kids' wedding. And there's a wedding hall in Geula, and a wedding hall in Geula means there's a wedding on every floor, right, at one time. It's very easy, and this happened to my nieces on multiple occasions, that they spent hours at the wrong wedding. Mechitza, you don't really know. Listen, it's not the worst thing. You still have a mitzvah of, making the bride and groom happy. But I noticed at this wedding, near the door was a table set out with a big pot of cholent and a pile of challah rolls. And people just came in off the street. They knew there was a wedding going on, filled up a bowl of food to eat, washed, took bread, and left. And it wasn't like they weren't wedding crashers. It actually, like Job's Shiva house, is imagined as communal infrastructure that is there to provide care for those who are on the inside, and that reciprocally sees its responsibility as providing care for the outside. And so much so, right? Not that they actually become members of your household, the text goes on to say. They even have a transactional relationship to you. But even so, word spreads, and the house or the synagogue or the Jewish community becomes a place that is identifiable with a culture of care. Ultimately, then, the Midrash in Tehillim comes along to describe this as the story for Avraham, right? Avraham awakened righteousness in the world by making a lodge for travelers and opening its door to all winds and receiving passerbys and returnees. And they use this on reference to the word Vayita Eshel. He planted a tamarisk tree, which the Midrash goes on to say is an acronym for Achila, Shtia, Lina, right? Food, drink, and rest. Somewhere between Avraham and Job is this notion that the communities that we are supposed to construct are those that provide care for others and in return provide care to us. In Genesis 12, Avraham does not need care quite the same way, although he is himself a journeyer. Presumably, he and his family needed places of rest along the way on their journey. But the time where this becomes really important is in Genesis 22. Or Genesis 18 rather, at the beginning of Genesis 18, Abraham is sitting outside of his tent because he is in recovery from his circumcision. And there are midrashim that describe that the angels who were coming to tell Abraham about what was happening in Sodom were doing so on the premise of Bikur Cholim. That was God sending messengers to visit the ill. So Abraham's tent, right, is a place which starts as an opportunity for him to provide care to others, but also reciprocally becomes the place in which he is met with care. What happens if we take seriously that when we talk in the Jewish community about the responsibility or the need to build a big tent, that it really is meant to be a tent like that of Abraham and Job, and not, as it oftentimes means to those using these terms, it's not really a tent, it's an ark. A place that it's actually sealed from others, that you have to find really hard ways to figure out your way in, and in which you are trapped against your will and against the dangerous elements on the outside. If that's what we have in mind, it's striking to me how little of the big tent conversation is actually about care, and how often the big tent conversation is about norms and rules and obligations and safety and danger. If, in fact, this is the metaphor by which a big tent should operate, it strikes me that our discourse around that tent very rarely comports with the actual metaphor itself. Now, are there ways in which somebody who is trying to build a big tent premised on welcoming and warmth and care might still resist certain people from being in that tent? Well, of course. The people who you would most likely resist are those who do not enter to care for others, who don't make that part of their commitment, or who commit acts of violence on the tent itself. It's very legitimate to imagine that Abraham's tent or Job's tent were somebody to come in and say, I'm not here to offer comfort to you or even to just receive comfort myself, but I'm here to knock down the tent poles, right? I'm here actually to flood the zone with people who really want to take the catering trays and leave. Is it legitimate to say, maybe you've overstayed your welcome? Sure. But that would still mean that your primary commitment to negotiating the question of what the tent is about is a focus on what it is meant to serve, as opposed to all of the anxieties of what happens when it is being damaged and vandalized all the time. The third text I wanted to give to you to consider, and this is a little bit of a move, it's just a suggestive idea. In the book of Exodus, we have this amazing teaching about if the ox of your enemy goes astray, right? You need to actually intervene, right, to restore the ox of your enemy back to your enemy. And there's this incredible move in the Midrash where the rabbis try to suss out what enemy is implied here. Well, who's the enemy? The first guess of the text is idolaters. Rabbi Elazar says, nope, it's a proselyte who backslid. Rabbi Yitzchak said it speaks of an Israelite. There's a move all the way from thinking of enemy as an outsider to now enemy as an insider. First of all, I find this very validating. This means like the text is telling us, you are allowed to think of other Jews sometimes as your enemies. Congratulations, we get that back. You don't have to feel so bad about it. The rabbis did it too. Right? There are times when our fellow can be our enemy. Why then? Is he called your enemy? If he hit your kid or is very quarrelsome with you, ne'esa oivo l'sha'a. In that moment, a person becomes an enemy. So I want to notice, what does this do? This, going back to our kinship premise, the strongest argument for those who are part of you is that even kinship has its limits. There are going to be moments when somebody is not acting like your kin and is not really consenting to be part of your community, and the rabbis give us a kind of permission to say, for that moment, that person is your oyev. And even so, you still have obligations towards them. This is the first teaser to what I feel has become the challenge in Jewish life over the past 2 years. Let's say I could take all of this good story about the validating of personal autonomy as a fundamental necessity of what it means to build communities as Jews, that we don't obsess with kinship, we give people back consent. Great. And let's say I take this aspirational idea that our Jewish communities should be a big tents of care and compassion, both for us as well as for others. Beautiful. What happens in these eras and in these moments where even for just a moment, for a sha'ah, where I perceive that somebody is hitting me or quarreling with me, and I have to classify that person as an oyev. What do I do to those beautiful ideas of community? Now, my relationship with you is not defined by care anymore. Now my relationship with you, partly because you are kin, and because I'm not sure you consent to my community and its rules, where now you're my oyev. Now I'm told in that environment, I still bear obligations towards others. That feels obvious, right? If a member of our community or a member of our family does things that make them feel like they're my oyev, does that exonerate me totally of my responsibilities towards them? The answer by Chazal is no, right? Because you have to return the stray oxen even of your enemy. And zachin la'adam shelo befanav. I have to do things on behalf of others that benefit them. But am I allowed to also hold on to some notion that the rules can be a little bit different in a moment of danger than are required of us in that moment of safety? I think that's where we live right now. I think we live precisely on this place of intersection between our bias and I think the right bias. That the reason we are in the business of leading, of constructing communities and leading them is because of the majesty they provide, the care that we provide to others, the sense of warmth and safety that we feel. I think we all know that we are in this business as rabbis and community leaders, having chosen to do so in an age of autonomy. We chose ourselves to be Jews. We chose ourselves to be Jewish leaders. And we know that the fact that sometimes people don't pick our team feels bad, but it is ultimately validated by all of these texts that tell us that actually consent has majesty and magic associated with it, and it elevates our communities magnificently when people do choose us, and they do want to be a part of it, and it's not just that they're there because they feel that they have to. We know how powerful all of that is, and yet we now find ourselves in a period where we feel a sense, even for a moment, that there are some people in our midst who feel to us like oivim. I guess the big take that I want us to think about, and I don't have any easy answers to this. This is not a halachic discussion. This is not like, here's exactly what we should do. The big take, and I'll offer a few directions forward for us. The big take is, how do we move the conversation in our community from care to safety and then back to care? Safetyism can be a permanently altering condition. It is a profound slippery slope. The minute you are anxious about boundaries or enemies, you will most likely, this is just a human psychological instinct, you will most likely look for constant validation of your fears more than you might be willing to step out on the ledge and engage in the risky behaviors of wondering whether you can be less scared. Watch what's happened in the Jewish community over the last couple of years around the very conversations of protecting our institutions. And it is almost impossible politically and otherwise to say, and probably it's the right thing, to say some version of, I think we should move back off of the ledge of protecting our institutions because it's coming at the cost of welcoming. This is, by the way, self-evidently true. It's almost impossible to do that. So absent that possibility, what else might happen? What shift might we have to make in order to reconnect with a narrative of care that is meant to characterize what it means to build holy Jewish communities? I'm going to give a couple of thoughts and then we'll open up for some discussion and comments. I gave you, not to study here, but maybe to take with you, a very provocative idea that Daniel Elazar, who I referenced earlier, offered in the 80s and 90s. He was right about most things. One of the things he writes about is, he says, you know how like in ancient Judaism, the Israelites were divided, the Jews were divided between the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes? We know that whole story. Elazar says, I think we should stop thinking about that as a particular historical set of conditions that happened in the first century. I think we should think about those categories as inherent to whenever the Jewish people are living through a period of sovereignty in the land of Israel. You're going to have basically three camps. Those who consider themselves fundamentally accountable to Jewish law, we call the Pharisees. one who's going to consider themselves fundamentally accountable to Jewish politics, survival, and the state itself. Those he calls the Sadducees. And then a bunch of ascetics who are fundamentally accountable to the spiritual. Elazar argues that one of the things that's happened in Jewish life since the creation of the State of Israel is the return of these categories. And here he says most Jews today are neo-Sadducees. It's true, by the way, of most rabbis I know, where the primary concern is questions of Jewish politics and Jewish survival. It's a fascinating turn. There's a lot to say about this. We could spend 2 hours on it. But the thing I want to just focus on or just think about is what happens to communities when they are governed entirely as the organizing principle of Jewish life by the political orientation that is imagined by neo-Sadducism. That's the thing. That's the thing we are protecting. Not Jewish law and practice, not the spiritual. One way that we start correcting the balance between care and safety is to start noticing, right, where the center of gravity in the Jewish community is and figuring out a way to bring it back into balance. The story of the division between Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes ultimately led to the destruction of the Second Temple, the demise of Jewish sovereignty, and 2,000 years of exile. If we continue to imitate the behaviors of Jewish politics of the past in the present, it becomes impossible for us to think about building communities of care that are willing to think past the limited categories that politics put us into, those categories that always are going to make us evaluate others through the categories of friend or foe, and would stretch us to be much more thoughtful about our accountability to things like obligation and Torah and spirituality that actually could build stronger communities of care. And I guess the last thing that I want to say, there's more to say. The last thing I want to say just is, it is legitimate to hear your own fears and concerns echoing through these texts. The Job story I find thrilling. Oh my God, this is the story. That's what Jewish community is supposed to be. Basically, I know I don't really mean this, but basically, Jewish community should feel like a Shiva house, minus the death. Right? There are many tragic Shiva homes, and then there are some Shiva homes that are sad and poignant and not tragic, and magical things are happening there. Generations are there. There's kinship, and it's a home based on kinship, and consent is those who walk in and walk out. We can be drawn to this, and we also can be drawn, as I am too, by the suggestion that sometimes even those who are your kin, Rabbi Elazar says, don't take the easy way out of describing your enemies as idolaters or Jews who backslid. Even those who are your kin are sometimes going to feel like they are your enemy. And in those moments, the big tent is a terrifying premise. What, am I going to let everybody in? They're going to ruin it for everybody. They're going to hit my people inside the tent. They're going to quarrel with me at a Shiva house. That happened to me once. I was teaching at my grandmother's Shiva, and it was a weird setup. My father was the ambassador to Israel. He was sitting Shiva in the ambassador's residence. Weird. Don't recommend. But interesting things happened. And I taught a Mishnah from my grandmother's during the Shiva, and an Israeli politician argued with me passionately, a politician later to become president of the State of Israel. And I was like, what are we doing here? So quarrelsomeness in the context of the Shiva, not a great feeling, right? It's okay to notice that that too is a fear. And I simply want to ask, what do we need to do in terms of defining the center of Jewish life, prioritizing what we ultimately want out of Jewish community itself? isolating the dangers in ways that don't metastasize, that don't turn all of our fears into so all-encompassing. What do we do to get back towards that story from care to safety and then back to care again? Thank you. Let's take some questions, comments. I think there's a couple of microphones. Yes, Alice and Shannon have microphones. Go ahead.
I want to push back a little on the care and safety kind of dichotomy, because something that I found kind of counterintuitive, even against the advice sometimes of law enforcement, is the more kind of safety we put into the synagogue by way of, guards or other types of things, the more people feel cared for in their own safety themselves. So just curious to think a little bit about how safety does show care, while at the same time it can also, I hear what you're saying the other way too, but they are not they seem more connected to me than perhaps you're admitting.
Yeah, I totally accept that. It's not like the two have to go completely at odds with each other, and I'm sure that for some people that is true, right? Especially, when the people who are protecting you are also shul members. I have questions about whether they're actually protecting me or not. You don't do that. Many shuls do. In addition to our shul does that, as well as hired security. By the way, I think the volunteers who are doing it do so because it's an act of showing care, right? So that's why it feels reciprocal. I want to just flag the ways that it is an obstacle to welcoming. There's no question about that. And I can't help but feeling every time I walk to shul and see our guard, who nobody will say if the guard is armed. I think they're armed. It makes me think about the dangers as the first thing I think about when I walk into shul. So you're right. It can be a mechanism of care for those who are ultimately in the inside. It can be a tool for making people then be able to say, I don't have to worry about what's going on outside the world because I'm protected at my gates. And it bleeds, both these categories bleed with one another in ways that I'm still struggling with. Yeah, Linda. Then I'll come to this side.
Can I bring us back for a moment from before October 7th and the physical threat and guards and all of that, although there were guards before that, to a pretty horrible time that was just before that, which was COVID. Mm-hmm. And after we were all separated from one another for however long, with 2 years, whatever, let's say 2 years, we started figuring out how we could come together because we needed to be together. But even at that point, there were rules and restrictions that I guess varied from one community to another. And there were people, in our community, there was a doctor who was the ritual chair also. He had the final say, and he laid down the law at the services. Remember this, remember that, remember the other thing. So I think the concept and the necessity for our creating protections, for our ability to protect each other and keep each other safe, not only from perceived danger, but from actual danger, is a positive. So I understand.
Yeah.
I understand the potential negatives. I see it as a positive, if it doesn't turn too negative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, that's the trick.
You listen, I actually think I read I appreciate the COVID piece because I think it's a really important additional lens to this question of care and safety. I read it totally differently. I felt for the 2 years that we experienced lockdowns and different waves and different phases, that the things we were doing to keep ourselves safe and keep one another safe, which were could be described within the broader frame of caring for one another, in the sense of like, I don't want to get you sick, were actually themselves stripping our capacity to build communities that were premised on actual care. That you couldn't do the classical activities of care that are prescribed very clearly in our tradition as the ways in which communities operate, principally bikur cholim, visiting the sick, and caring for the dead, and visiting the mourners. I mean, all of us have these stories. I'm sure all of you have stories of solo funerals and Shiva on Zoom. What is that? Right? And that just felt like this deep, it felt to me almost debilitating. Like, I didn't care about not going to shul to daven. That's just me. But I did care about I know you did. I did care about like not going to be with people, because that's what felt so critical. So you're right, in the larger sense, this is a good addition to Micah's comment, which is these care safety things, they travel with each other. Sometimes doing things that make us safe are ways, in a larger sense, of caring for others, but they're also inhibitors to the direct verbs that we oftentimes employ to actually express care. And I don't know that we've fully recovered from that, right? Except to the extent that coming to shul right after the news of October 7th, which I felt was an activity of standing uncomfortable. The whole intention was like, can we stand uncomfortably close to one another just to be in a room together? That felt to me like the first course correction from COVID. Like, that's what we're going to do. That's the opposite of what you would have done during the pandemic. Right? Everybody show up to shul in a moment of crisis. No, it's everybody stay home. So you're right, these dance with each other, but I felt like in a way that's opposite from your read. Like, it's not opposite, it's compatible, but
It's not the
yeah.
time we were staying home. It's the time when we were trying to figure out how we could come back together, but there were still restrictions.
Yeah.
Slowly but surely.
Yeah.
That was the time.
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of a security minimalist.
And we'll come to you next, yeah. Go ahead.
I'm kind of a security minimalist, and part of it is because I have a small synagogue, and it will bankrupt us.
Yeah.
So we won't survive as a community because we spent all our money on sometimes, which I think is performative. But the other thing I think about quite a bit is that we rent our school space to a non-denominational daycare. The doors are locked and you have to be buzzed in. They have no security. The kids are outside in front of the building playing every single day. They know they're in a synagogue, like they're aware, and they know that we take some security precautions. But I look at them and it makes me question, like, maybe we are a little crazy. Like, why aren't they scared? They're not Jewish, but they're in a Jewish space. Why aren't they scared? And they're really not. And I find that sort of comforting and disconcerting at the same time, but it makes me feel like how we think about security. I don't know. It makes me. It actually kind of reinforces my sense that in some cases we actually might be overdoing it.
You know,
And I don't say that too much at my board, because God forbid something should
don't say that.
happen. They'll be like, "Oh, the rabbi said we shouldn't be worried."
I know, that's the problem with these kinds of things, which is it's so immediately falsifiable.
Right.
It's so, the minute you make a commitment in one direction, one of the things that made me sad a few years ago, which I think may be corrected now, was just, is anybody here from LA? Yeah. So maybe this has changed, but the security of synagogues in LA has been underway for a long time, well before October 7th. And in some cases, it's real, like near military security outside of some of the synagogues. But I remember kind of observing this. I wrote a piece about this maybe 7, 8 years ago. If you walk down the street, if you walk down Pico, you have heavily fortified synagogues, and then you have shtiebels, which are storefronts, with the door open. And in other words, and it wasn't an ideological decision, it's completely a financial decision. Who can afford this and who can't? And by the way, afford in multiple ways. Whose constituencies allow and whose constituencies, they don't have any choice, so this is what we're going to do. And what it made me also worry about was now, in a context like that, it means that we're not thinking about safety from the standpoint of the Jewish people. We're actually thinking about safety within sub-tribes of the Jewish people. Because we know, by the way, that when people come to do harm to a Jewish institution, they will be turned away if there's somebody at the door. But it doesn't disincentivize them to finding a different Jewish institution. It just tells them not to target that one. And there was something very poignant and quite sad about the idea, well, these people can afford armed guards, and these people can't. So are we talking about the safety of the Jewish people, or are we actually talking about the safety of our own private institutions? And that raises very different questions about what we mean when we talk about collective safety. Yeah, I think David is next. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So much to think about. It's so rich and so many different ideas. But something that two things stuck with me. One is that when you're reading the Gemara in Shabbos, you're reading it in a very selective way, and I was wondering about that because it would seem that the Gemara seems to be setting up a sequential stages that are both necessary, and you've kind of focused very much on the Moda Rabbah aspect of Kimu v'Kiblu, but when you don't have kinship, you don't have the original, obligation or a sense of obligation. Maybe those two, I wonder how those two work together. And in places, for example, where Israel, as it were, is the Torah, let's say, of the Neo-Sadducean Torah of the last half century, if you're born in Israel, it's almost like it's kavalim harkegigis, that's a given. And then you have the ability to kind of choose how you want to relate to Israel. But if you're not born there, you can kind of walk away or not engage on any level. And I wonder about that. And the second thing I wanted to ask you, and if you can speak to both, is that in communities like, let's say, mine, where the tent was so wide open, it was like it was just open. And my experience was that it wasn't about feeding or concrete actions of care. Ideas and words and prayers themselves became gestures and the language and coding of care. And eventually, because it was so wide, it created lack of care because it was impossible to meet all of the needs of the people in the community. And essentially we set it up so that we said, here's a buffet, and people started walking in and saying, well, I'm allergic to that, and you didn't think about my gluten-free allergy, and I'm allergic to that prayer. And so it became a lack of care when we didn't include ideologies and thoughts that then were positioned as, I don't feel safe in this space because of X, Y, and Z. So how do you speak to that, where those things work, it seems, off each other?
So I'm happy to expand the category of care to include not just the tangible behaviors of Bikur Cholim and Nichum Avelim, right? But to include things like prayer and study as ways in which we engage the divine and one another. Right? And the ways that those channel deep personal necessities for all of us, that we feel when I'm in a community where I can pray, I am cared for, when I can pray for my needs, and by the act of participating, I care for others. You see this beautifully actually in so many synagogues where a person will come to daily minyan in their year of mourning. And then after that year of mourning, they stay because they recognize that actually care is expressed by those who stayed before them to make possible for them to have a minyan, and now they feel that kind of obligation, that debt of care and returns on the other end. So what you're describing is not a tension around care, not care. What you're describing is too significant a culture of consent, of consumer consent, right? Without perhaps a sense by your stakeholders of the flip side of consent, which is also obligation. What do I have to yield in this context to get on the other end? That's a real thing, right? In theory, right? In theory, we should kind of operate by the potluck principle. I'll bring something, right? I'll bring this casserole. And by bringing this casserole, which took some time and money to do, I'm going to get 7 other casseroles and a salad, right? I'm going to get things on the other end. And by the way, I don't have to eat all of them. I can only eat the things that I like, right? But there's something dysfunctional there. And I agree. There's something dysfunctional in communal life all the time. And the best strategies that we know are either giving people a non-overlapping menu of options, right? You be here for this. Don't worry about that. Or being super narrow. This is what we're here to do, and we're not here to do all those other things. And if you want to do all those other things, find a different community. So that's I think what you're getting at with that tension. In terms of the Gemara and Shabbat, I agree. I'm reading these after Kimu v'Kiblu, as there's a certain amount of course correction, and now we are the people who have inherited both of these. We. Not going to touch that. I think we've inherited these two stories. The question was, do you think it's significant it takes place after a genocidal moment in the book of Esther? I think that's a whole other thing. I will say I don't think contemporary Jews can say we are exclusively one of these stories or the other. So when someone says like, oh, there's a difference between someone who's born in Israel versus someone who's not, no, we are all constantly, let's take seriously that we are all constantly making choices about our Jewishness, our Jewish commitments, and our belongings. And some of us may feel like, what do you mean I'm making choices? This is who I am, I'm born into this, it's beyond my control, how could I ever leave? Great, you're lucky, you have that, and you have to stretch a little bit for greater compassion to those who are in the consent place. And others are in that consent place and can't wrap their head around the kind of obligated model of things. And those people we're going to have to figure out how to help them stretch. I think we should be on the side of pushing towards both of those as opposed to allowing one of them to have been hegemonic once and another hegemonic another time. There's a lot of questions. I should probably come to the middle, right? Go ahead.
So this actually relates to what we studied yesterday morning, that your opinion's not always right. Not you. Yours is always right.
No,
I'm
quite sure mine are not always right.
But David, what you're talking about is if you're at this potluck, there are going to be things you can't eat. There are going to be, if we are all to be in a community together, we have to recognize that some of them aren't going to be like us or things that we like. And I think those two topics pair really well.
Yeah.
That how do we stay welcoming in this idea of consent, but part of that consent is consenting to be uncomfortable and consenting for there to be something I can't eat next to something I can.
So look, I think the key text there was the one about the enemy, right? Because by saying he became his enemy for that moment, it confines that coding of someone else as your opponent or as your enemy for a temporary moment that's prompted by a certain set of aggressive behaviors. But we know this has gone out of control. The coding of others as enemies has conveyed a sense of permanence, right? You're now my enemy for life, right? Or you are my enemy and can never re-engage with me at any time. And it has grown well beyond, you're my enemy because you have engaged in a particular grievous behaviors that actually endanger me and wound me. to all sorts of other things that I just don't like. You make me uncomfortable is not the same thing as you make me unsafe. Right? It's just not. And that's where we have to exercise that kind of caution. And I don't quite know, I know we struggle with this, all of us, all the time, that when our people are operating in an environment of choice, they will weaponize that against us and say, if you choose not to provide everything to me that I can eat, or everything to me that I like, or these things that also offend me, I can opt out. And I just feel we can't play into it. We have to teach a Torah that says, your opponent, your enemy, is only your opponent or your enemy on the basis of very particular grievances and only temporarily. And otherwise, all of us are stretching to make something work that we collectively benefit from on the other end. Go ahead, yes. Oh, you go ahead and then the second one. Go ahead. It's fine.
The community that I don't lead, but I witness, is dealing with the problem of who poses the danger to the big tent. So we say the synagogue is a big tent, and there are those who, to be, not to go into detail, let's just call them the pro-Israel versus the pro-Palestinian, and which also gets translated into pro-rabbi against rabbi. Mm-hmm. And so there is a danger in this tent, but who is to determine who is the danger and how to reconcile the community so that they can live together in spite of these very big issues that get translated into the community at large. Because who shows up at the anti-Israel rallies and who shows up at the pro-Israel rallies?
Yeah. I mean, I guess part of the argument for temporary encoding of enemy versus permanent encoding of enemy is to try to push us away from the notion that because a person holds to a particular viewpoint, they are permanently encoded as your enemy, especially when we know that there's such slippery manifestations of what somebody means when they say pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. I mean, we really know this, right? Pro-Israel. If you use the index of like the Israeli Knesset to give a range of positions that are called pro-Israel, it gives you a window into what's possible when someone says pro-Israel here, and the same goes when it comes to pro-Palestine. So really that's what I think part of what we're getting at is like, how do we prevent those painting in those brushes in ways that make it impossible to constitute community after conflict? That feels like one. The second is this neo-Sadducee thing. Like when we notice that piece of our political identity has become the sum total of our identity, the only boundary we really police, the only difference that we care about, there's something not well in our Judaism. There's something not whole in our understanding of who the Jewish people are. It feels unhealthy. And I guess the third thing is, I tried to be careful when I wrote my piece back in November of 23 to talk not about individuals, but about institutions. I think it is reasonable for the institutional and organized Jewish community to have said then, and to continue to say now, hey, the map of institutions who hold legitimacy within the big tent of Jewish communal organizations has changed. And some organizations have moved themselves out. And by the way, in some cases, they did so deliberately. They also didn't want to be implicated by the Jewish community itself, and they wanted to stand against it. But the risk always is that individual Jews are not institutions. They don't have the limited choices that institutions have to make. Individuals can hold complex views in ways that institutions that have to hold and adhere by mission statements can't embody. Human beings can change much more fast, much more quickly, and in much more complex ways that institutions can change. And it'll be very, very dangerous for us if we as a community continue to police the boundaries of our community based on institutional loyalties, as opposed to simply policing the institutional boundaries of the Jewish community based on institutional loyalties. We can't allow that slippage to happen. Go ahead.
I was struck that both you and the text from Heidi Herd both raised issues of rights, when commonly we think of Jewish life as working in the world of mitzvah and claims, as David Hartman would say. And this was a conversation which kind of threw me a bit, that we have to function more with regard, or at least not in this area. We're thinking about this American theme of rights. So if you could expand on that a little bit further, I'd really like that.
Yeah, well, the best text on this is Robert Cover on Judaism's encounter with essentially both America and modernity is a real tension between Judaism speaking a language of obligations and America speaking a language of that primarily orients around rights. I think the plausible thing to understand, even if that's your dichotomy, right? And I don't totally agree with a dichotomy. Even if that's your dichotomy, at best what you can say is, great, now I have both of these. Right? I guess where I disagree is, I don't think these Chazal texts are operating purely within a language of obligation. I think they are dissenting against the notion that Judaism is about a set of obligations that are foisted upon you without the power of consent and the empowerment of the human. And here I think David Hartman was very clear. He writes in A Living Covenant about the fundamental difference between Abraham and Noah is that Noah was given a set of instructions that he simply obeys, despite the fact it involved a betrayal of the rest of the human condition. Despite the fact that he was willing to tolerate mass death of everyone around him, he put his head down and he built the ark. And Avraham, in contrast, is the dissenter. He actually embodies the power of human moral instinct, which, by the way, is being created in the image of God. So you actually are invested with a great deal more personal autonomy, the dignity of personal autonomy, to actually even resist an obligation that comes from God. And he captures this in a reading of a Midrash where he says, this is why Noah is described as Noah walked with God, and Avraham walks in front of, right? That there's actually, Avraham gets elevated precisely through the dignification, that's not a word, the dignity that he models in actual autonomous leadership. So yes, I am erring on this side, much more on the side of what consent does, and it's partly to help us address our bias, and I share it too, that when people aren't following in our ways, they're just being moderns. And I'm like, no, they're also being Jews. And the covenant of community is actually this much more dynamic thing between the obligations that we assume are premised in kinship and the dignity that is afforded on the other side of consent. Elliot, right hand. You're good? Daniel? No? Go ahead.
Okay. So thank you.
Wait, Andy.
The mic's coming.
Thank you so much for your teaching. I first have a comment and then a question. Yeah. The comment is about the how you experienced the COVID and the changing of community. And I just want to say I was someone who sat Shiva 3 times during that time, once right before COVID and twice during COVID. And the experience of sitting during COVID was actually better than the one after, in that the Zoom allowed people from all over the world to stop by. Yeah. The outside parts of it, which has then enabled me to think about my own congregants who are homebound, who are nursing homes, who are like ways to create community that are without the bounds. So that's, I at first was like, how are we ever going to do this without people coming over? Yeah. And it ended up becoming actually better for me personally, and then giving in the community. So I'm struggling with, and maybe someone else is here, the idea of how we exclude people from community when we think they are our foes. So I love the Mechilta text. And what are your feelings about can we exclude people who not are quarrelsome once or twice, but really create an atmosphere of quarrelsome, create a lack of Shalom Beit, Aleph, and Bet, the one that's coming up now in my community, is can we choose to exclude avowed anti-Zionists who want to be in the community, who say, I have consented to be in this community, I am a member of this community, and I want the community to include me and my anti-Zionist ideology.
Are we talking about including? Are we talking about agreeing? Are we talking about platforming? Right, so let's talk about the difference between those, because that's, to me, where the real questions lie. I would like to be able to be a Jewish people that is non-Sadducean, right? Not exclusively Sadducean, which embraces that those who consent, who are eager to be parts of communities of care, not merely to transactionally benefit from it, and not merely to mobilize it and leverage it in their own interest, but genuinely want to be part of our communities, I am very eager for that to include folks with wide, diverse political views. If the one that makes you uncomfortable is the anti-Zionist political view, find the one that makes you, find the inverse, right? The Jews who, in your community, feel threatened by the politics of others, maybe not about Israel, maybe about domestic issues, maybe about personal status issues, personal identity issues. We know that ultimately our communities have to be able to accommodate difference. We also know that we are living through a period of global and domestic polarization that we did not create, but where Jews basically mirror the habits of activities of larger populations. So the fact is, Americans in general are relocating to live in congressional districts together with neighbors who vote alongside them. That is a real thing that's happening. We know that churches as well as synagogues are dividing very significantly among partisan lines, and people are choosing to only go to the local church that accords with their political view, and this has been happening in synagogues for decades. Right? If it's invisible to you, it's not invisible to the social scientists who are watching you. It's happening everywhere. We know that something about what it means to be Klal Yisrael is supposed to say, that's not right. It's not right. We also know that our orientation, born of our understanding of Chazal, is that the commitment to pluralism is supposed to be something that is the antidote to the Pharisee-Sadducee Essene moment in antiquity. It is supposed to be the fundamental antidote, which says big disagreements don't need to destroy societies as long as you're willing to take on the epistemological humility of saying, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. God is capable of inhabiting multitudes. Human beings have the limitation of only embracing finitudes, and our job is to figure out how to find the divinity in multiple positions at the same time, especially when they are issues of Chaye Olam, the stuff of this world, the Chaye Sha'ah, the stuff of this world, and we share a larger commitment to Chaye Olam. We know we're supposed to do all of those things. In practice, what is breaking down is maybe a little bit of fear, right? A little bit of the oyev stuff. This person feels like an immediate danger to me and to my family who is under threat from bombs, right? I get that. I feel it pretty acutely too. Maybe sometimes it comes from a little bit of fear that we are not strong enough mare de'atra, leaders of our own community, with a clear message about what we stand for and what the core commitments of our institutions are, that someone else who wants to be part of that institution is going to have to know very clearly that they are operating in an environment where their positions don't become policy. We're not great at setting up as norms and then holding to them acts of derech eretz. So that if someone is particularly quarrelsome, it's not just that they're violating the rules, it's that they will become so at odds with the community they want to be a part of that they will have no choice but ultimately to leave or be pushed out, not necessarily by you, but everyone else who's like, you're not playing by the rules by which we operate. So that's an agenda. And it's very different than the question of when someone comes along and says, I hold to a different view than everyone else holds. I am entitled by virtue of the fact that I pay membership to be platformed. That is just not true. It's not true at any institution in the Jewish community. It's not true. I had a beautiful exchange last year in the spring with a handful of Hartman Teen Fellows. We run this amazing program for teenagers across North America. This fall we have almost 400. And they're all at these 2 Shabbatons. And it's a very tense moment for the Jewish people. And we at Hartman, we're not teaching them banal stuff. We're in it, right? And a handful of students came over to me at the end of the Shabbaton and said, you know, it's one of these like, I'm asking for a friend. We wanted to know, can anti-Zionists be part of this Hartman Teen Fellowship community? And I said, you know what the Institute stands for? And they said, yes. I said, are you willing to be here as a learner, actively participating in the core activity that we do? They said, yes, we love it. We want to be a part of this. I said, are you willing to accept that your viewpoints might not find themselves on the stage? Probably won't. They said, yeah, it's okay. We just want to be part of this. I said, not only do you have a right to be part of this community, but you have a right to then hold us accountable that if we're not consistent to our commitments to pluralism, if we're allowing your views to be demonized in ways that you think are unfair, if other students are ostracizing you because of your views, you have the right to hold us accountable. Now, not every synagogue is pluralistic. In fact, most are not, right? By definition, if you belong to a denomination, you have constraints in your pluralism. It's true for anybody. These are the things that people are allowed to argue about. These are the things that people are not allowed to argue about. By the way, forget about anti-Zionists. If somebody walks into your Reform temple and says, there needs to be a mechitza, it's very obvious. You can be like, you are welcome to pray here. We would love to get to know you, but shut the hell up. We're not putting up a mechitza. That's just not happening. And you would probably have a lot of backing, right? Maybe don't say that. Maybe there's probably a nicer way to say it, whatever, right? That's very clear. So we're right at the razor's edge, in part because this is increasingly a set of ideas that people with sincere commitments hold, even if you think they're wrong. And I think we just have to be really sharper about what it means to be clear about our values, to differentiate between what it means to permit people to be in our community and give them rights in our community versus enabling them to kind of take the stage and the pulpit. We have to be really good about cultures of norms that make possible to communities they want to create. And then we got to stretch ourselves to create something countercultural to the larger environment we're in which people who hold different political views can't occupy the same communities. Because in the long run, refusing to engage that countercultural question is going to leave our communities in an incredibly precarious place. I don't think, by the way, it's a tragedy that there's a growing number, it's still small, of anti-Zionist shuls. I don't think that's a tragedy. I think that's just typical historical denominational behavior when a group of people say, I care mostly about this, and I want to be together with the people I'm with. And if they want to get together and have Shabbos together and daven together, net, probably good for the Jewish people. It will be a tragedy, however, if the folks for whom it's not their only organizing commitment in Jewish life, who are not irreparably severed from their friends and family and the communities that they were belonging to beforehand, if those people feel that just because they hold a set of views on this particular issue that set them apart from their friends, even though they share a tremendous amount of history and love and other commitments together with other people, if they feel that they are forced to exit out of this story. It will be a tragedy for us because we will have then created a set of Jewish communities that don't adhere to our own values and our own commitments. And that will mean that we have elevated this particular issue above all else and made it a boundary drawing issue that we refuse to negotiate about. And especially when we know that even when someone says they're an anti-Zionist, that can mean like 1,000 different things. That decision is a decision to take something, a kernel of something, and to turn it into something that could be far more destructive than it has to be. I think I'll stop there. Thank you, everybody.